24 hours earlier, Nancy Mello had been standing in the cramped bathroom of her studio apartment, staring at the eviction notice taped to her mirror. 3 months behind on rent. While the landlord's patience, stretched thin as tissue paper, had finally torn. She'd read it twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it into her purse alongside the electric bill she couldn't pay and the medical invoice from Lily's last checkup. The pile of things she couldn't afford had become a weight she carried everywhere, pressing down on her shoulders until even breathing felt like work. But that morning Mrs. Chen from 4B had knocked on her door with an offer that felt like divine intervention. A family emergency in San Francisco. A first-class ticket already purchased, non-refundable. Would Nancy be willing to fly out and help with her daughter's newborn for 2 weeks? $3,000 plus room and board. Nancy had said yes before Mrs. Chen finished asking. $3,000 meant rent, meant electricity, meant Lily's daycare for another month, while Nancy rebuilt her doula client list that had evaporated when she'd gotten too exhausted, too poor, too desperate to maintain the serene, capable image new mothers needed. She'd grown up learning that desperation had a smell. Her mother had worn it like perfume, sharp and sour, clinging to thrift store clothes and apology letters to creditors. Nancy had sworn she'd never pass that inheritance to her own daughter. Yet here she was, 28 years old and drowning in the same waters that had claimed her mother's dignity. Her father had left when Nancy was 6, trading a family for a woman with fewer stretch marks and more potential. Her mother had worked 3 jobs and still came up short, dying of a heart attack at 52 in the checkout line at Walmart, her cart full of sale items she'd never get to buy. Nancy had learned early that the world didn't reward kindness or hard work. It rewarded luck, and she'd been born without any. She'd gotten pregnant at 19 by a boy who'd promised forever and delivered 6 months before disappearing like smoke. She'd raised Lily alone, working as a hospital janitor while finishing her nursing degree online, 1 credit at a time, stretching 4 years of school across 7. Becoming a doula had felt like finding her calling, using her struggles to help others navigate theirs. But calling didn't pay bills. Calling didn't keep the lights on when clients cancelled or delayed payment or decided they didn't need her after all. The plane ticket had been a miracle, a chance to reset, to come back with enough money to breathe for a month or 2. Nancy had never sat in first class before. The seat had felt too soft, too spacious, like she was trespassing in someone else's life. She'd kept her head down, her hands folded. The bodyguard's hand emerged from his jacket, holding exactly what Nancy expected, cold metal that caught the cabin light like a promise. But his eyes held something else. Confusion. As if women didn't usually walk toward Marco Bellini, especially not women who looked like they bought their clothes at Target. Step back. His voice was gravel scraped across concrete. Now. Nancy's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept moving forward. 1 step, 2. The baby's cries had deteriorated into something worse than screaming, a wet, gasping sound that spoke of exhaustion and surrender. "I can help," she repeated louder this time, projecting her voice over the infant's distress. "I'm a postpartum doula. I know what he needs." The guard, Enzo, she'd later learn, moved to physically block her path, but a single word stopped him cold. "Wait." Marco Bellini's voice was everything Nancy had imagined and worse. Silk wrapped around steel, beautiful and lethal in equal measure. He shifted in his seat, and suddenly she could see him fully. The sharp angles of his face, the dark stubble that shadowed his jaw, the eyes that looked like they'd witnessed the end of the world and ordered it personally. He was holding his son like a bomb that might detonate, arms stiff and uncertain, the baby's face scarlet and slick against his expensive shirt. "You're a what?" Marco's gaze raked over her. The discount blouse, the sensible flats, the absence of jewelry that might have value. She watched him calculate her worth in seconds and find the sum lacking. "A doula. I help mothers after birth. I've worked with hundreds of newborns." Nancy's voice steadied as she fell into professional mode, the place where she knew exactly who she was. "Your son is hungry. Formula isn't working because he needs something else." Marco's jaw tightened. "He's been fed the bottle." "Some babies can't settle with formula. They need." Nancy hesitated, knowing what she was about to offer would change everything. "They need breast milk, human contact. I can provide both." The cabin went silent except for the baby's weakening cries. Even the engines seemed to hold their breath. Enzo's gun didn't waver. Boss she could be. I know what she could be. Marco's eyes never left Nancy's face, reading her the way he probably read his enemies, looking for tells, for weakness, for the lie beneath the truth. "Why would you help?" "Because I buried my mother in a pauper's grave. Because I know what it's like to watch something precious slip away while you stand helpless. Because that sound is killing me as much as it's killing you." "Because he's suffering," Nancy said simply, "and I can stop it." Marco studied her for another endless moment. She saw the calculation happening behind those black eyes, the risk assessment, the worst-case scenarios, the pride that warred with the desperation of a father watching his son break apart. Finally he stood. The baby writhed in his arms, face buried against his shoulder, tiny body rigid with misery. Marco Bellini, who'd never bent for anyone, held out his son to a stranger. "Help him." Nancy took the baby, and the moment his weight settled into her arms, warm and solid and real, something cracked open in her chest. She sat down in the empty seat beside Marco, her hands already moving with practiced efficiency. unbuttoning her blouse with the clinical detachment of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. But her heart knew this was the first time it had ever mattered this much. The baby latched within seconds, his cries cutting off like a switch had been flipped. The silence that followed was devastating in its completeness. The silence in first class had texture, thick and reverent, like the air inside a cathedral. Even the flight attendants stopped their practiced movements, frozen in the galley with champagne bottles half poured, unwilling to shatter whatever fragile piece had descended. Nancy looked down at the baby in her arms, his tiny fist curled against her skin, his breathing finally steady and deep. The frantic red had faded from his face, leaving behind the porcelain perfection of an infant who'd found exactly what he needed. His eyes, dark like his father's but still holding that unfocused softness of the newly born, fluttered closed. She'd done this hundreds of times, held other women's babies, guided them through latching problems and midnight feedings and the bone-deep terror of new motherhood. It was supposed to be routine, clinical, just another service she provided, but this felt different, sacred somehow, as if she'd stepped into a story that had been waiting for her since before she was born. "What's his name?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper, afraid to disturb the spell. Marco didn't answer immediately. She could feel him beside her, every muscle coiled tight like a predator forced into stillness. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its sharp edge, worn smooth by something that might have been grief. "Alessandro, after my father." Nancy shifted the baby slightly, supporting his head with the ease of long practice. "Alessandro," she repeated softly, testing the name. "It suits him, strong." His mother chose it. Marco's words fell like stones into dark water. 3 days before she died. Nancy glanced at him then, really looked at him for the first time since sitting down. Up close, she could see the faint shadows beneath his eyes, the tension that lived in his jaw, the way his hands rested on his thighs with fingers slightly curled, as if he wanted to reach for his son but didn't trust himself to hold something so breakable. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised her. Marco's gaze fixed on Alessandro, watching the gentle rise and fall of his son's chest. "She made me promise to keep him safe, to give him everything." His voice dropped lower, almost to himself. "But I can't give him this, can't give him what he needs most." Nancy felt something shift in the air between them, subtle as a change in atmospheric pressure. She recognized this moment, had seen it in dozens of new fathers, that instant when the enormity of parenthood crashed down like a wave. But with Marco Bellini it felt different, dangerous. "He needs food and warmth and someone to hold him when he cries," Nancy said carefully. "Everything else comes after." Marco turned his head, and Nancy found herself caught in the full force of his attention. His eyes moved over her face like he was memorizing every detail, the curve of her cheek, the pale pink of her lips, the small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood fall she barely remembered. "What's your name?" "Nancy. Nancy Mello." "Nancy." He said it slowly, tasting each syllable. Then quieter, almost reverent, "You saved his life." "I just fed him. Any nursing mother could." "But you did." Marco leaned forward slightly, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and dark, cedar and smoke. "You walked past a loaded gun to help my son. Why?" "Because I know what it's like to be helpless. Because I couldn't save my mother, but I could save him. Because some cries can't be ignored, not if you want to sleep at night. Because he needed me," Nancy said simply. Alessandro stirred in her arms, making the small contented sounds of a well-fed baby drifting toward sleep. Nancy began to button her blouse with one hand, the motion awkward but manageable. The Leonardo da Vinci airport sprawled beneath them like a concrete promise Nancy wasn't ready to keep. She'd spent the last 3 hours of the flight trying to explain, in increasingly desperate terms, why she couldn't simply disappear into Italy with a man she'd just met. A man whose last name she'd only learned when the flight attendant had whispered it to her colleague, with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints or monsters. Marco Bellini. The name had made the attendant's face go pale. Nancy had Googled him in the bathroom, hands shaking as she scrolled through carefully worded news articles that said everything by saying nothing at all. Alleged organized crime figure, suspected involvement in multiple unsolved cases, known associate of the Bellini crime family. The photos showed him at charity galas and restaurant openings, always in perfect suits, always with that same cold expression that suggested he was mentally calculating how many ways he could kill everyone in the room. Alessandro slept peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the fact that his father was apparently a real-life mafia boss, and his temporary wet nurse was having a complete psychological breakdown. "I have a daughter," Nancy had repeated for the 10th time as the plane began its descent. "She's 13 months old. She needs her mother." "Bring her." Marco hadn't even looked up from his phone, as if relocating a toddler across an ocean was as simple as ordering dinner. "I'll send a plane. She'll be here by tomorrow night." "You can't just, people don't just." Nancy struggled to find words for the absolute insanity of the situation. "I have a life in America, responsibilities, a client waiting in San Francisco. I'll compensate them, double whatever they were paying. It's not about money. Everything is about money." Marco had finally looked at her then, his expression suggesting he pitied her naivety. "You just haven't learned to name the right price yet." Now, as the plane taxied toward a private hangar far from the main terminal, Nancy clutched Alessandro tighter and tried to formulate an escape plan. She'd return him to Marco, politely decline whatever obscene amount of money he offered, and catch the next flight home. Simple, clean, safe. The cabin door opened and Italian sunlight flooded in, warm and golden and completely indifferent to her panic. Marco stood, buttoning his suit jacket with the fluid grace of someone who'd never doubted his right to take up space. Enzo will take Alessandro. You'll come with me. No, Nancy's voice came out stronger than she expected. I've helped. I've done what I could, but I need to go home. Marco turned to face her fully, and Nancy saw something flicker behind his eyes. Not anger, which she'd expected, but something worse. Determination. The look of a man who'd decided how the story ended and wouldn't tolerate alternative narratives. You don't understand, he said quietly. In my world, debts are sacred. I owe you my son's life. That's not a debt I can repay with money. You don't owe me anything. I decide what I owe. Marco stepped closer, invading her space with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been told no. And I've decided that until I find a way to adequately repay you, you stay under my protection. In my home. Nancy's throat went dry. That's not protection, that's kidnapping. Call it what you want. Marco reached out and gently took Alessandro from her arms, his touch surprisingly tender despite the steel in his voice. But understand this, Nancy Mello. You walked into my life when I needed you most. You don't get to walk out until I'm finished needing you. He moved toward the exit, Alessandro cradled against his chest like something precious. Nancy sat frozen, her arms suddenly empty. The Villa Bellini rose from the Tuscan hillside like a cathedral built to worship power instead of God. Cream-coloured stone glowed in the late afternoon sun, surrounded by cypress trees that stood like sentries. Wrought iron gates opened silently as their convoy approached, revealing gardens that probably cost more to maintain than Nancy's entire lifetime earnings. She pressed her face against the car window, watching wealth unfold in manicured terraces and marble fountains. This wasn't just money. This was generations of it, blood-soaked and unrepentant. The East Wing will be yours, Marco said from beside her, Alessandro sleeping against his shoulder. 3 bedrooms, private bath, a sitting room. The nursery adjoins your suite. I don't need 3 bedrooms. Nancy's voice sounded hollow even to herself. I just need a flight home. You'll have that too, eventually. Marco shifted Alessandro carefully, and Nancy caught the ghost of tenderness in the gesture. But first you'll help me find a suitable nurse, someone Alessandro accepts, someone I can trust. Trust. The word felt poisonous coming from a man who'd essentially kidnapped her with politeness and a private jet. The car stopped in front of massive oak doors that looked like they'd witnessed centuries of Bellini family history. The staff materialized instantly, serious-faced men and women in crisp uniforms who took bags and opened doors with choreographed efficiency. They looked at Marco with something between reverence and fear. They looked at Nancy like she was a curiosity that might explode. Signore Bellini, an older woman, approached, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun. "Welcome home. The nursery is prepared as requested." Grazie Maria. Marco handed Alessandro to her with visible reluctance. "This is Nancy Mello. She'll be staying in the East Wing. See that she has everything she needs." Maria's sharp eyes assessed Nancy from head to toe, missing nothing. Not the discount clothes, not the absence of luggage, not the fear barely concealed beneath a veneer of composure. "Of course, Signore, Miss Mello, if you'll follow me." Nancy glanced back at Marco, some desperate part of her still hoping he'd laugh and say this was all an elaborate misunderstanding. But he was already walking away, phone to his ear, barking orders in rapid Italian. She'd ceased to exist the moment he'd finished giving instructions. Maria led her through halls lined with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors and into a suite that made Nancy's entire apartment look like a closet. The silk curtains, antique furniture, a bed large enough to sleep for comfortably. Everything smelled faintly of lavender and old money. "The Signore has requested you dine with him tonight," Maria said, her English precise but heavily accented. "It's 8 o'clock, formal attire." "I don't have formal attire. I don't have any attire. My luggage is being handled." Maria moved to a wardrobe and opened it, revealing an array of dresses Nancy hadn't owned 2 minutes ago. "These should fit. The Signore is very thorough." Nancy's stomach turned. "He bought me clothes before I even agreed to stay." Maria's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. Pity, maybe, or recognition. "The Signore always knows what he wants, Signorina. It's easier not to fight it." After Maria left, Nancy sank onto the bed and pulled out her phone with shaking hands. No signal. Of course not. She was in the middle of nowhere, in a villa that probably had signal jammers along with armed guards and whatever other security measures Mafia bosses considered standard. She thought about Lily, probably eating dinner right now with Nancy's mother, unaware that her mother had been absorbed into someone else's life like she'd never existed. A soft knock interrupted her spiral. She opened the door to find Enzo, Marco's mountain of a bodyguard, holding a silver tray with a single piece of paper on it. Nancy unfolded it, recognizing Marco's precise handwriting immediately. "You gave my son life when I couldn't. Now let me give you one worth living. Everything you want, everything you need, it's yours. You just have to stop running from it. Tonight at dinner we'll discuss the terms of your employment." Come prepared to. Nancy chose the simplest dress in the wardrobe, black, modest, with sleeves that covered her arms like armor. She braided her hair with hands that only shook a little, staring at her reflection in a mirror that probably cost more than her car. The woman looking back seemed like an imposter playing dress-up in someone else's castle. Maria appeared at precisely 7:55 to escort her downstairs. "A word of advice, Signorina," she said quietly as they descended the marble staircase. "The men at dinner tonight are not like American men. They do not believe women belong in their discussions. Do not give them reason to disrespect you. And if they disrespect me anyway." Maria's lips twitched with something that might have been approval. "Then show them why the signore chose you. The dining room could have hosted a small wedding. A table stretched beneath crystal chandeliers, already occupied by 6 men in expensive suits who stopped talking the moment Nancy entered. Their eyes tracked her movement like wolves watching unfamiliar prey, assessing, calculating, finding her wanting. Marco sat at the head of the table, Alessandro asleep in a bassinet beside him. He stood when he saw her, and every man at the table reluctantly followed suit. Old-world manners covering new-world violence. "Gentlemen," Marco said in English, though Nancy suspected it was for her benefit. "This is Nancy Mello. She'll be caring for Alessandro." The nurse, the man to Marco's right, spoke with barely concealed contempt. He was older, silver-haired, with the kind of face that suggested he'd forgotten how to smile decades ago. How generous of the American to help the boss with babysitting. Nancy felt the insult land, saw Marco's jaw tighten. But before he could respond, she pulled out her own chair and sat down without waiting for assistance. "Actually, I'm a postpartum doula. I specialize in keeping infants alive during their most vulnerable months. How many children have you kept alive, Mr. Russo, Antonio Russo?" His eyes narrowed. "And I've kept many people alive, Signorina. Also made many people dead. Important distinction in our world. Funny, in my world, the men who threaten women at dinner tables are usually compensating for something." Nancy reached for her water glass, proud that her hand remained steady. Small hands, maybe, or small. "Nancy," Marco's voice cut through the sudden tension like a blade, but she caught the ghost of amusement in his eyes. Russo's face had gone purple. Another man, younger, with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, laughed outright. "She has teeth, Capo. I like her." "Nobody asked what you like, Luca." Russ turned back to Nancy, his hostility sharpening. "You think you can walk into this house and disrespect men who have bled for the Bellini family. You're nothing, a hired." Alessandro chose that moment to wake with a sharp cry. Nancy stood immediately, moving to the bassinet before Marco could. She lifted the baby with practiced ease, cradling him against her shoulder, and swaying in the gentle rhythm that usually soothed. But Alessandro's cries intensified, his face reddening. Nancy felt panic flutter in her chest. Not now, not in front of these vultures who were waiting for her to fail. Perhaps the American nurse isn't so skilled after all, Russo said, satisfaction dripping from every word. Nancy ignored him, focusing on Alessandro. She checked his diaper, felt his forehead for fever, tried the pacifier Marco handed her. Nothing worked. The baby's screams filled the dining room like an indictment. Then she noticed it, the way Alessandro kept turning his head toward Marco, searching, not hungry, scared. He didn't recognize this place, these voices, this chaos of male energy that filled the room with tension. He needs his father, Nancy said quietly, meeting Marco's eyes across the table. Not a nurse, not hired help. His father. Something shifted in Marco's expression. He stood, crossing to her in 3 strides, and Nancy placed Alessandro in his arms. The baby quieted almost instantly, tiny fist curling into Marco's shirt. The room fell silent. "My son knows what matters," Marco said, his gaze. Nancy found him on the terrace at 2 in the morning, silhouetted against the Tuscan night like a monument to isolation. She'd woken to Alessandro's cries through the baby monitor, but by the time she'd reached the nursery, Marco was already there, holding his son against the window and whispering something in Italian that sounded like a prayer or a confession. He'd waved her away without looking, and she'd retreated. But sleep wouldn't come after that, so she'd wandered the villa's dark halls until she saw him through the glass doors. Alone, smoking a cigarette, staring at nothing. She should have gone back to bed, should have respected the invisible walls he'd built around himself. But something in his posture, the way his shoulders curved forward like he was carrying a weight that might break him, made her push open the door. "You smoke," she said, stepping into the cool night air. "Only when I can't sleep." Marco didn't turn around, which is most nights lately. Nancy moved to the railing beside him, keeping a respectful distance. The estate sprawled beneath them, dark and silent except for security lights that dotted the perimeter like earthbound stars. Alessandro settled quickly. He just needed his father. He always does. Marco took a long drag, exhaling smoke into the darkness. "I'm all he has left of her." The grief in his voice was raw, unguarded in a way Nancy hadn't heard from him before. This wasn't the controlled Don who commanded dinner tables and bent reality to his will. This was just a man, alone in the dark, drowning. "Isabella," Nancy said softly, remembering the name from her frantic Google searches. "You loved her." "Love," Marco's laugh was bitter. "I possessed her, owned her, kept her in a cage made of gold and called it devotion." He finally turned to face Nancy, and she saw something broken behind his eyes. She wanted to leave. Said she couldn't breathe in my world. I told her she'd learn. Nancy's chest tightened. Marco. 3 months pregnant, she tried to run, made it as far as the airport. His voice dropped to something barely audible. I dragged her back. Told her she was mine, that she'd always be mine, that our child deserved his mother. He crushed the cigarette against the railing. And then I killed her anyway, just slower. Childbirth complications aren't. She hemorrhaged because her blood pressure was through the roof. Her blood pressure was through the roof because she spent 9 months terrified. Marco's hands gripped the railing until his knuckles went white. The doctors said stress was a factor. So tell me, Nancy, whose fault is it that my son has no mother? The question hung between them like a confession waiting for absolution Nancy wasn't qualified to give. She understood now why he'd been alone on that plane, why no nanny or nurse or family member had been with him. This was penance, forcing himself to face his inadequacy, to feel the helplessness Isabella must have felt trapped in his world. You can't undo it, Nancy said finally. But you can do better for Alessandro, be different than you were with her. How? Marco turned to her fully, and she saw the desperation naked on his face. I don't know how to be anything but what I am, a monster who loves things to death. Nancy thought about the way he held Alessandro, the gentleness that crept into his voice when he spoke to his son, the way he'd publicly defended her at dinner despite his associates' resistance. Monsters don't question what they are. You're just a man who's made terrible choices. That means you can make different ones. Like letting you go home to your daughter. His voice held challenge and something else. Hope, maybe. That she'd argue against her own freedom. Yes, Nancy said, even though the word felt like a lie. Like letting me go. Marco studied her face in the moonlight, searching for something she wasn't sure she wanted him to find. What if I can't? What if I'm too broken to let go of the things that save me? The question terrified her, because she could see the answer already forming in the space between them, dangerous and inevitable as gravity. Then we're both in trouble, Nancy whispered. Marco reached out slowly. Nancy noticed the shift 3 days later, subtle as a change in barometric pressure before a storm. The guards who usually nodded politely now watched her with hawk-like intensity. Maria's warm efficiency had cooled into clipped professionalism. Even Luca, the scarred associate who'd laughed at her boldness during dinner, avoided her eyes when they passed in the hall. Something had changed, and Nancy's survival instincts, honed by years of navigating poverty's razor edge, screamed that she was at the center of it. She was feeding Alessandro in the nursery when Marco appeared in the doorway, flanked by Enzo and 2 other guards she didn't recognize. His face was carved from stone, every trace of the vulnerable man from the terrace erased. We need to talk. His voice was pure command, the Don fully restored. Now. Nancy's stomach dropped, but she kept her voice steady. Alessandro just started eating. Give me 10 minutes. Enzo will finish. Marco's tone left no room for negotiation. Nancy reluctantly handed the baby to Enzo, whose massive hands cradled Alessandro with surprising gentleness, and followed Marco down the hall to his office, a room she'd never been invited to enter. Dark wood leather chairs, walls lined with books that probably concealed safes and weapons. Marco closed the door with a finality that made her skin prickle. "Someone leaked your presence here." He didn't ease into it, just delivered the blow straight to her chest. "The Corsini family knows about you, knows you're close to Alessandro, knows exactly where to find you." Nancy's mouth went dry. "The Corsini family. My enemies." Marco's hands curled into fists on his desk. "They've been trying to destroy me for 3 years. They killed my father, tried twice to kill me, and now they know that the woman who saved my heir lives under my roof. And if you think they'll come for me, I know they will." Marco's eyes met hers, and she saw fury burning beneath the ice. "Your leverage, the easiest way to hurt me is to take what I care about." And if the admission hung between them, what I care about, too honest for the moment, too dangerous to acknowledge. "So send me home," Nancy said, hating the tremor in her voice. "Put me on a plane tonight, I'll disappear. They can't use me if I'm gone." "It's too late for that." Marco moved around the desk, invading her space with predatory grace. "They have your name, your photograph, your daughter's name. You think leaving Italy protects you? You think they won't follow you to America and burn down everything you love to send me a message?" Nancy felt the room tilt. "Lily, they know about Lily. Everyone knows everything in my world." Marco's voice softened fractionally. "That's why I'm moving you both to the safe house tonight. You, Alessandro, Lily, she's already on a plane with a security detail. She'll be here by morning." "You kidnapped my daughter." Nancy's voice climbed toward hysteria. "I saved your daughter." Marco gripped her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "Because someone in my organization betrayed me. Someone I trusted gave the Corsini family every detail about you. Which means nowhere is safe except where I put you." Nancy's mind raced through the faces she'd met. Russo's open contempt, Maria's sudden coldness, Luca's averted eyes. Who? "I don't know yet. The admission seemed to cost him. But I will, and when I find them they'll beg for the mercy of a quick death." A knock interrupted them. Enzo entered without waiting for permission, his face grim. "Capo, we have a problem. Russo's missing. Left the grounds 2 hours ago. No one's been able to reach him." Marco's expression went arctic. "Find him, and when you do, bring him to me alive. I want to ask him some questions before he stops breathing." They never made it to the safe house. The attack came at dawn, when the sky was still bruised purple and the villa's security was changing shifts. Nancy heard the first gunshot from the nursery where she'd been packing Alessandro's things, the sharp crack splitting the morning silence like bone breaking. Marco was beside her in seconds, gun already drawn, his face transformed into something feral. The panic room. Now, what about Lily's? Her plane's been diverted. She's safe. He grabbed her arm, propelling her toward a bookshelf that swung open to reveal a steel door. "Get inside. Don't open this for anyone but me." More gunshots closer now, shouting in Italian, the sound of breaking glass. Nancy clutched Alessandro to her chest, the baby startling awake with a cry that Marco silenced with a finger to his lips. "Please," he whispered, and she saw something roar in his eyes. Fear, not for himself, for them. "Please, Nancy. Get inside." She stumbled through the door into a room that was part bunker, part luxury suite. Reinforced walls, monitors showing security feeds, enough supplies for a week-long siege. The door sealed behind her with a hydraulic hiss that sounded like a coffin closing. Alessandro screamed, sensing her terror, his tiny face going scarlet. Nancy forced herself to breathe, to rock him, to sing the lullaby her own mother had sung when the electricity got shut off and the apartment went dark. Her voice shook, but the melody held. On the monitors she watched hell unfold. Men in black tactical gear poured through breached windows and shattered doors. Marco's guards fought back with brutal efficiency, bodies dropping on both sides. She saw Enzo take down 3 men before disappearing around a corner. Saw Luca catch a bullet in the shoulder and keep firing. And she saw Marco. He moved through the chaos like death given form, precise, efficient, merciless. Every shot found its target. Every movement was calculated. He wasn't fighting. He was eliminating obstacles between himself and the people trying to reach his son, trying to reach her. Nancy's hands shook as she watched a man in tactical gear find the hidden bookshelf, find the panel, start working on the electronic lock. The safe room door was impenetrable, Marco had said, military grade. Nothing gets through. But Nancy had spent her life learning that nothing was truly safe. Alessandro had finally quieted, exhausted from crying, his tiny body heavy with sleep against her shoulder. She looked around the room desperately. What could she use? What would stop armed men if they breached the door? Her eyes landed on the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. Not much of a weapon, but mothers had defended their children with less. She watched the monitors as the tactical team multiplied. 8 men now, surrounding the bookshelf, one of them placing something against the lock that looked sickeningly like explosives. Nancy's breath came in short gasps. She laid Alessandro in the reinforced crib bolted to the floor, kissed his forehead with shaking lips, and positioned herself between him and the door with the fire extinguisher gripped in white-knuckled hands. On the monitor, she saw Marco round the corner and see the men at the safe room entrance. Saw his face transform into something beyond rage, beyond human. He didn't hesitate, didn't take cover, just walked straight into their line of fire like a man who'd already died and forgotten to fall down. The gunfight lasted 30 seconds. When it ended, Marco was the only one standing, covered in blood that probably wasn't all his, and the men who'd tried to reach his son were scattered across the marble floor like broken dolls. Marco's hand slammed against the safe room panel. "Nancy, it's me, it's over." She didn't move, couldn't. Her body had locked in place, fire extinguisher raised, ready to die protecting a child that wasn't even hers. "Nancy." His voice cracked. "Please let me in." She looked at the monitor one more time. Russo had been the traitor, just as Marco suspected. They found him 3 days after the attack, hiding in a Corsini safe house with enough cash to disappear and enough arrogance to believe Marco wouldn't find him. He'd been wrong on both counts. Nancy didn't ask what happened to him. She'd learned that some questions in Marco's world were better left unasked, their answers written in the sudden absence of people who'd made fatal mistakes. Lily arrived on the 4th day, carried through the villa's repaired doors by a female bodyguard who looked like she could bench press a car. Nancy's daughter, beautiful, perfect, oblivious to the violence that had nearly consumed them, reached for her mother with chubby hands and said "Mama" like it was the only word that mattered. Nancy held her daughter and wept. Marco watched from the doorway, Alessandro in his arms, and something shifted in his expression. Not the possessive hunger she'd grown accustomed to, but something quieter. Recognition, maybe, of what family actually meant when it wasn't built on fear. That night, after both children were asleep, Nancy found Marco in his office staring at documents he wasn't really reading. She knocked once and entered without waiting for permission, a small rebellion that made his lips twitch with approval. "I'm staying," she said before he could speak. "Not because you're holding me hostage, not because I'm afraid, but because Alessandro needs me, and because—" She paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like surrender. "Because I think you need me too." Marco set down his papers with careful precision. "I've spent my entire life taking what I wanted and calling it love. With Isabella, with this empire, with everything I touch, I turn it into a prison." He stood, moving around the desk but stopping a respectful distance away. "I won't do that to you. If you stay free. Your choice, always your choice. And if I choose to leave someday—" The question hung between them like a test. Nancy watched emotions flicker across Marco's face. The old possessiveness, the fear of loss, the desperate need to control. But then something else emerged, something that looked almost like trust. "Then I let you go," he said quietly, "and spend the rest of my life grateful for the time you gave me." Nancy closed the distance between them, her hand finding his. "I watched you kill a dozen men to keep us safe. I should be terrified of you." "You should be." Marco's fingers tightened around hers. "I'm still a monster, Nancy. You're still capable of terrible things." "No," she reached up, touching his face with her free hand. "You're a man who's done terrible things. That's different. That means you can choose to do better. With you, or not a question, a statement of intent." "With me," Nancy confirmed. "But I have conditions. Lily comes first always. I make my own choices about where I go and what I do, and you don't get to buy me things without asking." She paused, a smile tugging at her lips. "Except the clothes, those were actually nice." Marco laughed, a real laugh, rusty with disuse but genuine. "Is that all?" "One more thing." Nancy's expression turned serious. You teach Alessandro to be different than you were. To love without owning, to protect without controlling, to be strong without being cruel. I don't know how to do that. Then we'll learn together. Nancy leaned forward and kissed him, soft, tentative, the first honest choice she'd made since walking onto that plane. That's what family does. Marco pulled her close, careful despite his strength, like she was something precious that might break. I love you, he whispered against her hair. I don't know when it happened or how to do it right, but I love you. Nancy felt tears burn her eyes. She'd spent her whole life invisible, fighting to survive, raising her daughter alone in a world that didn't care if she drowned. And somehow, impossibly, she'd found herself at the center of a kingdom where a monster had learned to be human. I love you too, she said, and meant it. Now let's go check on our children. Our children, the words felt right, natural, like they'd always been building toward this moment, two broken people creating something whole. Marco took her hand, and together they walked upstairs to where Alessandro and Lily slept in adjoining rooms, protected by guards who'd learned that the woman who'd once been invisible was now the most important person in the Bellini Empire. Before you go, if this story moved you even a little, hit the like button, drop a comment and follow the channel for more powerful stories like this. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa. If this video gave you chills, share it with someone who needs to see it.